The world's nuclear order is unraveling. The U.S. nuclear umbrella, once a cornerstone of global security, is now under strain as rivals like China, Russia, and North Korea expand their arsenals. America's allies, long reliant on U.S. protection, are questioning whether those guarantees will hold in a crisis. This uncertainty is driving some allies to consider developing their own nuclear weapons, a move that could shatter decades of non-proliferation efforts. The risk of miscalculation is rising, and the old guardrails are gone. If allies lose faith in U.S. resolve, the world could see a dangerous wave of new nuclear states. The very system designed to prevent proliferation is now at risk of fueling it. The stakes have never been higher. South Korea, facing a nuclear-armed North, is openly debating its own bomb as doubts about U.S. protection grow. In Europe, NATO's eastern members like Poland are watching Russia's aggression and wondering if American promises will hold. The UK and France have nukes, but their arsenals can't replace the US guarantee. If one ally goes nuclear, others, like Japan, may follow, triggering a domino effect. The period before a new arsenal is operational is especially dangerous, inviting preemptive strikes and instability. More nuclear states mean more fingers on the trigger, and a world where crises escalate faster. Preserving the Non-Proliferation Treaty and keeping allies non-nuclear is vital to global security. The alternative is a fractured, unpredictable nuclear landscape. For 70 years, America's nuclear umbrella deterred adversaries and reassured allies, anchoring global stability. This strategy kept allies from building their own bombs, limiting proliferation and centralizing control in Washington. The U.S. gained strategic depth, influence, and a stable alliance system. Fewer nuclear states meant fewer risks of miscalculation or accidental war. America's leadership was the glue holding this system together, but as doubts grow, that cohesion is at risk. The world is now questioning whether the old model can survive. Today's threat environment is more complex than ever, with China, Russia, and North Korea all modernizing their nuclear forces. U.S. allies hear growing debate in Washington about the costs of global commitments. This uncertainty erodes trust in the American nuclear shield. Allies, fearing abandonment, are openly discussing their own nuclear options. These conversations signal to adversaries that the alliance is vulnerable. The feedback loop of doubt and anxiety makes the world less stable. The cracks in the nuclear shield are visible to all. The future of global security hangs in the balance. Faced with this new and unsettling reality, American allies are being forced into a difficult and dangerous reassessment of their national security strategies. The core of their dilemma is a painful question. Can they continue to entrust their ultimate survival to a security guarantee that appears increasingly conditional? For generations, the answer was a confident yes. Now that confidence is wavering. South Korea provides the most acute example of this strategic predicament. The nation lives under the constant threat of a nuclear-armed neighbor whose arsenal is growing more sophisticated by the day. The traditional U.S. commitment, while still formally in place, is now viewed through a prism of doubt. South Korean leaders must calculate whether the United States would truly trade San Francisco for Seoul, a classic Cold War dilemma that has gained a terrifying new relevance in the modern era. This existential anxiety is driving a national conversation that was once taboo, pushing the country closer to a decision that could reshape the security landscape of Northeast Asia. The situation in Europe, while different in its specifics, is animated by a similar undercurrent of fear. Nations on NATO's eastern flank, such as Poland, are on the front lines of a confrontation with a nuclear-armed Russia that has demonstrated its willingness to use brutal force to achieve its geopolitical aims. While the nuclear arsenals of the United Kingdom and France provide a layer of European deterrence, they were never intended to and cannot replace the sheer scale and scope of the American nuclear umbrella. These allies watch the political winds shifting in Washington and worry that in a future crisis, American strategic priorities might focus inward, leaving them dangerously exposed. The thought that they might have to face a nuclear blackmailing Russia without the full and certain backing of the United States is prompting a quiet but urgent reevaluation of their long-term security options, including the once unthinkable path of nuclear acquisition. This reassessment is not happening in a vacuum. It is being driven by the tangible actions of America's adversaries. China's massive buildup of its nuclear forces, including the construction of hundreds of new missile silos, is not aimed solely at the United States. It is also designed to intimidate U.S. allies in the region and to raise the potential costs of American intervention to a level that Washington might deem unacceptable. Similarly, Russia's frequent nuclear signaling and its large stockpile of non-strategic nuclear weapons are intended to coerce and divide the NATO alliance. These actions are a form of strategic warfare aimed directly at the credibility of the US nuclear shield. They are designed to sow doubt, to foster fear, and to convince American allies that the umbrella is full of holes, forcing them to accommodate the aggressor's demands or risk annihilation. Consequently, the Allies' dilemma is becoming more acute with each passing day. They are caught between their long-standing reliance on a United States, whose commitment seems less certain, and the terrifying prospect of facing nuclear-armed bullies on their own. This is the crack in the shield that adversaries are so keen to exploit. For Washington, this is a moment of profound strategic choice. A failure to recognize and address the legitimate fears of its allies will not only weaken its alliances, but could also trigger the very outcome that extended deterrence was designed to prevent: a cascade of nuclear proliferation among friendly nations. This would not make America safer. The emergence of new, nuclear-armed states, regardless of whether they are long-standing American allies, would represent a fundamental and deeply perilous shift in the international order. For more than half a century, a cornerstone of global security has been the effort to limit the membership of the nuclear club. This policy, enshrined in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, was based on the simple but powerful logic that more fingers on the nuclear trigger inevitably means more opportunities for catastrophic use. If countries like South Korea or Poland were to pursue their own arsenals, it would shatter this long-held norm, effectively opening a Pandora's box of instability that Washington has fought tirelessly to keep sealed. The world would enter a new, far more unpredictable era where the established rules that have governed nuclear behavior, however imperfectly, would be rendered obsolete, replaced by a chaotic landscape of multiple independent nuclear actors with varying levels of restraint and experience. This proliferation would not simply add more players to the game, it would fundamentally change the nature of the game itself. The relative stability of the Cold War, characterized by a bipolar standoff between two superpowers who gradually developed a mutual understanding of deterrence, would be a distant memory. A multipolar nuclear world would be exponentially more complex and harder to manage. Calculating deterrence would become a nightmarish exercise in multidimensional chess, with each nuclear state having to consider the intentions, capabilities, and red lines of every other nuclear state. The potential for miscalculation, misinterpretation of signals, or accidental escalation would skyrocket. A regional crisis between two newly armed nations could quickly draw in other nuclear powers, creating a tangled web of interlocking security dilemmas that could spiral out of control with terrifying speed, threatening global catastrophe. Moreover, the very character of these new nuclear states would introduce new dangers. Unlike the established nuclear powers, which have had decades to develop sophisticated command and control systems, safety protocols, and doctrines for the use of their weapons, new entrants would be starting from scratch. Their arsenals would likely be smaller and potentially less secure, making them more vulnerable to theft by terrorists or seizure during a coup or civil unrest. Their leaders and military establishments would lack the deep, institutional experience in managing the awesome responsibilities that come with possessing nuclear weapons. This inexperience could lead to rash decisions in a crisis, an overestimation of the deterrent effect of a small arsenal, or a failure to appreciate the subtle signaling required to manage a nuclear standoff without stumbling into war. Ultimately, the spread of nuclear weapons to U.S. allies would undermine the very security they seek to achieve. While the immediate goal might be to deter a specific regional threat, the long-term consequence would be a world that is far less safe for everyone, including the United States. Washington has long understood that its security is inextricably linked to the prevention of nuclear proliferation. A world with a dozen or more nuclear powers is a world where the United States is more likely to be dragged into nuclear conflicts, where its homeland is at greater risk of attack, and where its ability to project power and maintain stability is severely compromised. Keeping the Pandora's box of proliferation closed is not an abstract ideal. It is a core, non-negotiable American interest. The journey from deciding to build nuclear weapons to possessing a credible, survivable deterrent is long and fraught with extreme danger. During this transitional phase, a proliferating state is at its most vulnerable. Adversaries who feel threatened by the prospect of a new nuclear neighbor may conclude that their window of opportunity for action is closing fast. They might be tempted to launch a preventive military strike to destroy the nascent nuclear program before it can become operational. This use it or lose it logic creates a powerful incentive for preemptive aggression. For example, if South Korea were to begin enriching uranium or constructing facilities for weaponization, North Korea, China, or even Russia might calculate that a swift, decisive strike is preferable to living permanently under the shadow of a new nuclear threat on their doorstep. This would not be a limited skirmish. It would be an act of war with a high probability of escalating into a major regional conflict. The United States would inevitably be drawn into such a crisis. An attack on a U.S. ally, even one undertaking a policy Washington opposes, would be nearly impossible to ignore. America would be faced with an agonizing choice: either stand by as its ally is attacked, shattering the credibility of all its security commitments worldwide, or intervene militarily, risking a direct confrontation with another nuclear-armed power like China or Russia. The very act of proliferation by an ally, intended to increase its own security, would paradoxically create the conditions for a great power war that the U.S. has sought to avoid for decades. The path to acquiring nuclear weapons is therefore not a safe bridge to security, but a tightrope walk over a chasm of instability, with the potential for a catastrophic fall at any moment. This period of vulnerability is not just a theoretical concern, it is a reality grounded in historical precedent. Israel's strike on Iraq's Osirak reactor in 1981, and its strike on a suspected Syrian nuclear facility in 2007, are clear examples of nations taking military action to prevent proliferation in their neighborhood. An aspiring nuclear state would have to develop its program under constant threat of discovery and attack. This would necessitate extreme secrecy and a rapid development timeline, which in turn increases the risks of accidents, design flaws, and the creation of an unsafe and unreliable arsenal. The immense pressure of this window of vulnerability could force a nation to rush its program, cutting corners on safety and security protocols that are essential for responsible nuclear stewardship, thereby creating a different but equally potent set of long-term dangers. Even if a preventive strike is not launched, the threat alone would be profoundly destabilizing. The proliferating state would exist in a state of heightened alert, its leaders paranoid and its military on a hair trigger. Any ambiguous action by an adversary could be interpreted as the prelude to an attack, potentially leading the new nuclear state to take rash, preemptive actions of its own. This tense, crisis-prone environment would poison regional relations and make diplomatic solutions to underlying conflicts nearly impossible to achieve. The pursuit of nuclear weapons, far from being a panacea for security anxieties, would instead plunge a region into a new and terrifying era of brinkmanship, where the slightest misstep could trigger the very war the weapons were meant to deter. Should a prominent U.S. ally like South Korea successfully develop nuclear weapons, the geopolitical shockwaves would be felt across the globe, likely triggering a cascade of proliferation. This is often referred to as the domino effect. Nations that had previously relied on the non-nuclear norm and American security guarantees would be forced into a painful strategic recalculation. In Northeast Asia, for example, a nuclear-armed South Korea would place immense pressure on Japan. With its historical rivalries and proximity to threats from China and North Korea, Tokyo would find it almost politically and strategically untenable to remain non-nuclear. The domestic consensus against nuclear weapons, in place since 1945, could crumble in the face of a new reality where its neighbors and potential adversaries are all nuclear-armed. A Japanese decision to go nuclear would, in turn, create further instability, fundamentally altering the balance of power in the Pacific. This chain reaction would not be limited to Asia. A decision by Poland or another Eastern European state to acquire nuclear weapons in response to a perceived decline in U.S. commitment would send tremors through Europe. Germany, a nation with a deep-seated aversion to military power projection due to its history, might feel compelled to reconsider its non-nuclear stance if it found itself surrounded by a nuclear-armed Russia to its east and a nuclear-armed Poland as its immediate neighbor. The delicate strategic balance within NATO would be shattered, replaced by a continent of suspicious, independently armed nuclear powers. The proliferation dominoes could even topple in the Middle East, where countries like Saudi Arabia and Turkey have long been suspected of harboring nuclear ambitions, which they might feel justified in pursuing if the global non-proliferation regime collapses. Such a wave of proliferation would deliver a fatal blow to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the landmark 1968 agreement that has been the cornerstone of efforts to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons for over 5 decades. The NPT is built on a grand bargain. Non-nuclear states promise not to acquire weapons in exchange for a commitment from the 5 original nuclear powers to pursue disarmament and to share peaceful nuclear technology. If key non-nuclear states, especially those seen as responsible status quo powers, violate their commitments and break out of the treaty, the entire regime would lose its legitimacy. The NPT would be exposed as a paper tiger, unable to prevent determined states from acquiring the ultimate weapon. Its collapse would remove one of the most crucial brakes on nuclear proliferation, leaving the world without a shared legal or normative framework to manage the nuclear threat. The end of the NPT would usher in an era of unchecked atomic anarchy. Without the treaty's verification mechanisms, including inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the world would lose its ability to monitor peaceful nuclear programs and detect clandestine weaponization efforts. Suspicion and mistrust would run rampant, as every nation with a significant civilian nuclear industry would be seen as a potential proliferator. This would create a dangerously opaque and unstable environment where arms races are fueled by worst-case assumptions. Keeping the NPT alive and credible is therefore a vital American interest. Its unraveling, sparked by proliferation among its own allies, would be a self-inflicted wound of catastrophic proportions, making the world infinitely more dangerous for the United States and everyone else. Even if a new nuclear state successfully navigates the perilous development phase and avoids a preventive attack, the resulting strategic landscape would be anything but stable. A common misconception is that nuclear weapons automatically create stable deterrence, a balance of terror that prevents all conflict. The reality is far more complex and dangerous, as illustrated by the so-called stability-instability paradox. This paradox suggests that when rival nations both possess nuclear weapons, the perceived stability at the nuclear level can actually make lower-level conventional conflict more likely. Leaders may feel emboldened to engage in aggression below the nuclear threshold, believing their nuclear arsenal provides a shield against escalation. We can see this dangerous dynamic playing out in South Asia. The nuclear standoff between India and Pakistan has not ended conflict between them. Instead, it has created a context for repeated conventional clashes, border skirmishes, and state-sponsored terrorism, with each side testing limits under the shadow of the bomb. The 2019 Balakot crisis, which saw aerial dogfights and missile strikes between the two nuclear-armed neighbors, was a terrifying reminder of how quickly conventional conflict can escalate and bring nuclear risk to the forefront. A world with more regional nuclear dyads, a nuclear South Korea facing a nuclear North Korea or a nuclear Poland facing a nuclear Russia, would replicate this instability across the globe, creating numerous flashpoints where conventional wars could spiral into nuclear ones. Furthermore, new nuclear powers with small arsenals would face unique pressures that could lead to greater instability. A country with only a handful of weapons would be deeply concerned about their survivability in the face of a first strike from a more powerful adversary. This could create intense pressure to adopt launch on warning or to use weapons early rather than risk losing them. This is a recipe for catastrophic miscalculation. A false alarm from an early warning system or misinterpretation of conventional military movements could trigger an irreversible decision to launch. Established nuclear powers have spent decades building redundant, survivable forces to avoid this predicament, but new nuclear states would not have this luxury, making their command systems inherently more fragile and crisis-prone. Ultimately, new nuclear states would degrade, not enhance, regional and global security. The illusion of stability from a small arsenal would be just that, an illusion, easily shattered by crisis management realities, survivability pressures, and the stability-instability paradox. For the United States, this would mean a world filled with new tripwires for nuclear war, conflicts it might be pressured to intervene in, and constant high anxiety. Preventing this outcome is paramount. The goal must be to reinforce existing security structures that have successfully prevented proliferation waves and maintained fragile peace, rather than allowing the world to slide into a chaotic future of multiple, unstable nuclear standoffs. One of the most remarkable features of the first nuclear age was the shared recognition, even between bitter adversaries, of the need for guardrails. The United States and the Soviet Union, despite their profound ideological conflict and global competition, came to understand that an unchecked nuclear arms race benefited no one. This mutual understanding gave rise to a series of formal arms control agreements and informal understandings designed to limit the growth, spread, and potential use of nuclear weapons. These were not acts of idealism but of pragmatic self-preservation. Leaders on both sides realized that their nation's survival depended on creating a degree of predictability and stability in their nuclear relationship, preventing the rivalry from spiraling into a catastrophic, world-ending war that neither side could hope to win. This era of arms control began in earnest during the height of the Cold War. After the terrifying brush with nuclear annihilation during the Cuban Missile Crisis, both superpowers saw the urgent need for communication and restraint. The strategic arms limitation talks of the 1970s represented a groundbreaking achievement. For the first time, Washington and Moscow successfully negotiated verifiable limits on the size of their strategic arsenals. These initial agreements, while not reducing the number of weapons, capped their growth and established a crucial precedent: that even sworn enemies could find common ground when faced with the existential threat of nuclear weapons. This created a foundation for dialogue and a framework for managing the most dangerous aspects of their competition, paving the way for more ambitious efforts in the decades that followed. The success of the SALT process led to a new series of agreements aimed at genuine disarmament. The 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty was a landmark moment, eliminating an entire class of ground-launched missiles that had threatened to turn Europe into a nuclear battlefield. This was followed by the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaties in the 1990s and most recently, the New START Treaty in 2010. These agreements did more than just limit arsenals. They initiated a steady and precipitous reduction in the number of deployed nuclear warheads and delivery systems from the absurdly high peaks of the Cold War. This managed drawdown of forces was a testament to the power of diplomacy and the shared interest in reducing the nuclear danger, creating a safer and more predictable world. These treaties were more than just pieces of paper. They created an architecture of transparency and verification that helped build confidence and reduce mistrust. On-site inspections, data exchanges, and dedicated communication channels gave each side a clearer picture of the other's capabilities and intentions. This reduced the risk of a surprise attack and dampened the worst-case scenario planning that fuels arms races. For decades, this system of formal and informal guardrails, though often strained, successfully managed the superpower nuclear competition. It was a golden age of arms control that demonstrated how responsible great powers could, through difficult but necessary negotiations, pull the world back from the brink and impose a fragile order on the most destructive technology ever created by humankind. Today, the carefully constructed architecture of nuclear arms control is, well, crumbling. The spirit of mutual interest and pragmatic cooperation that defined previous decades has been replaced by a new era of great power competition, deep-seated mistrust and, honestly, open disregard for established norms. Under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, Moscow has systematically chipped away at the foundations of this system. Russia has cheated on, withdrawn from, or allowed to expire a host of crucial agreements, including the landmark INF Treaty. Its actions really demonstrate a clear belief that these restraints no longer serve its strategic interests. This aggressive posture, combined with its development of exotic new nuclear delivery systems, signals a dangerous departure from the post-Cold War consensus and a return to a more confrontational and unpredictable nuclear strategy. At the same time, the People's Republic of China, now a major nuclear power in its own right, continues to stonewall any and all attempts to engage in arms control dialogue. Beijing argues that its arsenal is still much smaller than those of the United States and Russia and that it therefore has no obligation to accept limitations. This refusal comes even as China engages in the most rapid and opaque nuclear expansion in its history, building hundreds of new missile silos and modernizing every leg of its nuclear triad. This so-called Great Wall of Secrecy makes it impossible to gauge China's true intentions or the ultimate size of its arsenal, forcing other nations to plan for the worst-case scenario. China's intransigence effectively creates a fatal flaw in any future bilateral arms control framework between Washington and Moscow, rendering such agreements insufficient to address the new global reality. The most immediate and critical inflection point is the looming expiration of the New START Treaty in February 2026. This agreement is the last remaining pillar of the arms control architecture. capping the number of deployed strategic nuclear warheads for both the United States and Russia at 1,550 each, and providing for invaluable verification and inspection measures. Without a successor agreement in place, the world will be left without any legally binding limits on the world's two largest nuclear arsenals for the first time in more than half a century. The loss of New START's verification regime would be particularly damaging, plunging the US-Russia nuclear relationship into a state of opacity and suspicion not seen since the darkest days of the Cold War. The collapse of this treaty architecture would be a catastrophic failure of international diplomacy. It would signal the end of an era and the beginning of a period of unconstrained nuclear competition. At some point in the distant future, it is possible that Beijing, Moscow, and Washington may once again recognize that verifiable limits on strategic arms are in their mutual self-interest. But for the foreseeable future, the trend is moving decisively in the opposite direction. The United States must now prepare to face a world without the familiar guardrails that have helped maintain strategic stability for generations. It is a world where it will be potentially outnumbered and outgunned, without the established diplomatic tools to slow down or reverse the coming storm. The lack of guardrails makes this new nuclear age profoundly more dangerous than the last. The United States is entering uncharted territory, facing a set of interlocking challenges that it has never before encountered. During the Cold War, the strategic problem, while immense, was relatively straightforward. Washington had to deter a single great power, the Soviet Union, which possessed a nuclear arsenal of similar size and composition. The strategic calculus was based on a bipolar logic of mutual assured destruction. Today that simplicity is gone. The United States must now figure out how to deter two nuclear peers, Russia and China, simultaneously. These two powers have different strategic goals, different force structures, and a growing alignment against the US-led international order, creating a complex three-body problem that really defies easy solutions. This challenge extends directly to America's global network of alliances. For decades, the United States has assured its allies against a single primary nuclear threat in a specific theater. In Europe, NATO's posture was designed to counter the Soviet Union and later Russia. In Asia, the US presence was meant to deter threats from China and North Korea. Now, Washington must reassure distinct groups of allies located thousands of miles apart on land and sea against two separate and powerful nuclear adversaries. A crisis in Europe with Russia could unfold at the same time as a crisis in Asia with China. This would stretch American military and strategic resources to their absolute limit, forcing a US president to make impossible choices about where to allocate forces and which commitment to prioritize, potentially undermining the credibility of both. Furthermore, this new era introduces a novel and deeply worrying proliferation dynamic. Since the end of the Cold War, US non-proliferation efforts have focused on preventing so-called rogue states like Iran and North Korea from acquiring nuclear weapons. Washington has never before in this century had to contend with the serious prospect of its own treaty allies actively pursuing the bomb. The anxiety an ally like South Korea or Poland feels is a direct result of the growing power of China and Russia and the perceived decline in the reliability of the US nuclear umbrella. This creates a vicious cycle. As the threat from US adversaries grows, allies become more nervous, and their potential pursuit of nuclear weapons further destabilizes the global order, making the world even more dangerous. Without a successor to New START, the United States could soon find itself in a full-blown three-way nuclear arms race for the first time in its history. Both China and Russia will be free to expand their arsenals without any constraints, forcing the United States to respond in kind to maintain a credible deterrent. This would be a competition that Washington is currently ill-prepared to win. It would require a massive and sustained investment in its nuclear enterprise, divert hundreds of billions of dollars from other national priorities, and create a world hovering on a permanent hair trigger. There are no easy solutions to these multiplying threats, but failing to adapt US strategy to this unconstrained and more dangerous reality is not an option. In theory, the United States is already taking steps to upgrade its nuclear forces to meet the challenges of the 21st century. For the past 15 years, the government has been committed to a massive trillion-dollar-plus nuclear modernization program. The goal is to overhaul the aging land, sea, and air-based weapons that make up the American nuclear triad. This effort involves replacing systems that have been in service for decades with more advanced, reliable, and capable alternatives. For example, the Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missiles are slated to be replaced by the new Sentinel. The Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines are scheduled to be succeeded by the new Columbia-class submarines. The new B-21 Raider stealth bomber is being developed to penetrate the most sophisticated air defenses on the planet. It will be armed with a new long-range, nuclear-capable cruise missile. On the regional level, the United States began deploying the B-61-12 nuclear gravity bomb on F-35 fighter jets stationed in Europe. This provides NATO with more accurate and flexible capability to deter aggression in the European theater. On paper, this comprehensive plan appears to be a robust response to maintain a safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent. However, there is a fundamental and dangerous flaw at the heart of this entire modernization plan. It was designed for a world that no longer exists. The program was conceived back in 2009, a time of relative optimism in international relations. American strategic planners did not anticipate the sheer scale and speed of China's nuclear expansion, nor the aggressive resurgence of Russia. Washington assumed that the global number of nuclear weapons would continue to decline. The focus was on replacing old systems, not preparing for great power nuclear competition against multiple adversaries. This outdated foundation has led to critical shortcomings. The United States did not seek to replace its legacy capabilities on a one-for-one basis. Consider the sea-based leg of the triad. The current plan calls for replacing 14 Ohio-class submarines with just 12 new Columbia-class boats. While each Ohio-class submarine can carry 24 Trident missiles, the new Columbia-class will only carry 16. This reduction is happening at the very same moment that China is finishing construction on hundreds of new missile silos, creating a stark and growing modernization gap. Beyond its flawed strategic assumptions, the United States nuclear modernization program is facing a severe implementation crisis. Because nuclear-armed conflict was considered a low-priority risk for many years after the Cold War, many key components of the plan were started late. This initial procrastination has been compounded by significant and persistent delays, pushing the delivery of new capabilities years behind schedule, and sending costs soaring billions of dollars over their original budgets. This is not just a bureaucratic problem, it is a national security emergency in the making. The widening gap between the planned retirement of old systems and the delayed arrival of their replacements is creating a window of potential vulnerability that America's adversaries are surely watching with great interest. The arsenal is aging faster than it is being renewed. The troubles facing the Sentinel ICBM program are a stark illustration of this crisis. Originally intended to replace the aging Minuteman III missiles starting in the late 2020s, the Sentinel program is now projected to be at least 10 years behind schedule and dramatically over budget. This means the Minuteman III, a system designed in the 1960s, will need to have its life extended until at least 2050, far beyond what its engineers ever intended. Keeping these geriatric missiles operational will be an increasingly expensive and technically challenging feat, requiring constant maintenance and patchwork fixes simply to ensure they remain reliable. This is not a sustainable long-term solution, and it forces the United States to rely on a less capable system at a time of rising global threats. This pattern of delays and cost overruns is not unique to the land-based leg of the triad. Other critical elements of the modernization enterprise are also struggling to stay on track. This implementation failure has profound strategic consequences. Even if the United States manages to complete its modernization program exactly as it was planned back in 2009, the resulting arsenal will still be insufficient to confront the nuclear challenges of today and tomorrow. The world has changed dramatically in the past 15 years, but America's modernization blueprint has not kept pace. The United States is, in effect, building a nuclear force designed to deter the threats of the past, not the complex, multi-adversary environment it now faces. The result is a dangerous mismatch between America's strategy and its capabilities. The United States now officially recognizes the need to deter China and Russia simultaneously, yet it is building a smaller nuclear force based on the assumption of a single constrained adversary. This modernization gap means that for the foreseeable future, the United States will have to make do with an aging, shrinking, and increasingly fragile arsenal. it will be forced to manage the most complex nuclear threat environment in its history without the modern, flexible, and sufficiently numerous tools required for the job. This is a precarious position for a global superpower and a source of deep anxiety for the allies who depend on its protection. The challenges of the new nuclear age are not uniform, they manifest differently in different regions, requiring tailored deterrence solutions. In Europe, the primary challenge is confronting a revisionist Russia that has placed nuclear weapons at the center of its military strategy. Moscow possesses a massive and diverse arsenal of so-called non-strategic or battlefield nuclear weapons. Numbering up to 2,000 warheads, these lower-yield weapons are not constrained by any existing arms control treaty. Russia's doctrine envisions using these weapons on the battlefield to de-escalate a conflict on its own terms, essentially to win a conventional war by threatening a limited nuclear strike, believing that NATO would back down rather than risk a full-scale nuclear exchange. This strategy of escalate to de-escalate poses a direct and credible threat to the security of the alliance. To counter this threat, the United States and NATO must ensure they have a credible regional deterrent. The current posture relies heavily on a small number of B-61 gravity bombs deployable by dual-capable aircraft like the F-35 fighter jet. While the introduction of the modern B-6112 variant is a significant improvement in accuracy, the fundamental concept has its limitations. These are gravity bombs, meaning the aircraft must fly deep into enemy territory and directly over its target to deliver the weapon. As Russian air defense systems become increasingly sophisticated and lethal, the ability of these fighter jets to penetrate those defenses and successfully complete their mission becomes more and more questionable. Relying solely on this capability creates a potential point of failure in NATO's deterrent posture. NATO therefore has an opportunity and a pressing need to build greater resilience and redundancy into its nuclear sharing mission. The expansion of the alliance to include Finland and Sweden provides new strategic depth and geography. Furthermore, the widespread adoption of the common F-35 fighter platform offers a chance to broaden participation in the nuclear mission. However, these advantages must be paired with new capabilities. To overcome the challenge of improving Russian air defenses, the alliance may need to develop a new, longer-range air-launched nuclear weapon for its fighter jets. A nuclear-tipped cruise missile, for example, could be launched from outside the most dangerous threat rings, greatly increasing the survivability of the delivery aircraft and the credibility of the deterrent. Another option to explore involves more cost-effective, ground-based systems. During the Cold War, NATO deployed ground-launched cruise and ballistic missiles as a direct counter to Soviet SS-20 missiles. While the INF Treaty eliminated this class of weapons, its collapse now opens the door for a reassessment. Developing and deploying new ground-based missiles in Europe could provide a responsive and highly credible deterrent to Russian aggression without relying on penetrating air power. These are the kinds of difficult but necessary conversations that the alliance must have now. Without a robust and believable regional deterrent, Russia may be tempted to miscalculate, believing it can use its tactical nuclear advantage to bully and coerce its neighbors without fear of a proportional response. If the regional nuclear deterrent in Europe requires an upgrade, the cupboard in the Indo-Pacific is even more bare. The primary challenge in Asia is the tyranny of distance. The vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean make it incredibly difficult to project power and provide a timely and credible deterrent against a rapidly expanding Chinese nuclear force or a volatile North Korea. Currently, the United States relies heavily on its strategic bombers, such as the B-2 and B-52, to provide a regional nuclear presence. These aircraft, stationed thousands of miles away in the continental United States or on Guam, can deliver gravity bombs and long-range cruise missiles. But their effectiveness is hampered by the long flight times required to reach potential targets in the region. This reduces their responsiveness in a fast-moving crisis. To enhance its sea-based regional deterrent, the United States has recently developed and deployed a lower-yield nuclear warhead, the W-76-2, on some of its Trident ballistic missiles carried by Ohio-class submarines. The logic behind this weapon is to provide a more usable and proportional response to a limited nuclear attack by an adversary like North Korea. However, this solution comes with a significant trade-off. Every low-yield W-76-2 warhead that is deployed on a Trident missile must take the place of a much higher-yield strategic warhead. This reduces America's overall counterforce capability, and weakens the survivable second strike force upon which the deterrence of a major attack on the United States homeland relies. It is a stopgap measure that, well, really just robs Peter to pay Paul. A far more promising alternative is to develop dedicated regional deterrence capabilities specifically for the Asian theater. Recognizing this gap, the United States Congress mandated in 2023 that the Pentagon develop a new, low-yield, sea-launched nuclear cruise missile, often called the SLCMN, designed for deployment on American attack submarines. Such a weapon would be a game-changer. Deployed on submarines that are constantly patrolling the region, it could provide a persistent, survivable, and highly responsive deterrent. It could be used to deter China from using its own nuclear weapons first in a conflict over Taiwan, or to provide a limited escalation option that does not require resorting to strategic ballistic missiles. Crucially, it would also free up the Trident missiles to be armed exclusively with higher-yield warheads, strengthening America's strategic posture against China's growing silo fields. The problem, once again, is time. Given the Pentagon's track record with major acquisition programs, this new sea-launched cruise missile may not be ready soon enough to address the rapidly worsening threat. Policymakers must therefore explore faster ways to acquire this vital capability. One potential option is to modify existing Tomahawk cruise missiles, which are already carried by submarines, to carry a low-yield nuclear warhead. This could provide an interim solution while the purpose-built system is developed. Furthermore, planners should assess whether some of the future air or ground-launched missiles being considered for Europe could also be apportioned to the Indo-Pacific. Given the long timelines for developing new weapons, the United States must anticipate the future needs of both theaters now, so that it is ready when the storm inevitably hits. Should a regional conflict with China or Russia escalate beyond the confines of Europe or Asia, threatening the American homeland itself, Washington would have to rely on its central strategic deterrent. This is, the ultimate backstop of U.S. security, the force designed to deter a direct nuclear attack on the United States. In this new nuclear age, however, this core mission has become exponentially more complex. The United States now faces a world in which either China or Russia possesses the capability to test American resolve on its own, and, more alarmingly, a world where the two adversaries could coordinate their actions, either simultaneously or in rapid succession. This creates a daunting strategic conundrum. How can the United States deploy its finite nuclear forces to credibly deter one major adversary without critically compromising its ability to deter the other at the same time? This is the central deterrence challenge of the three-body problem. The Biden administration took a crucial first step in formally recognizing this dilemma in its 2024 Nuclear Weapons Employment Planning Guidance. This updated directive instructed the Department of Defense to shift its planning assumptions and prepare for the sobering possibility of deterring China, North Korea, and Russia simultaneously in peacetime, crisis, and conflict. This is a monumental shift from decades of strategic planning that was centered on a one major war construct. The broad implication of this new guidance is clear and unavoidable. To meet this challenge, the United States will need to deploy not only more warheads but also more delivery systems than were originally envisioned under the modernization program conceived in a more benign era. The current arsenal, and even the planned future one, is simply not sized or structured for this two-peer threat environment. To address this impending capability gap amid the persistent delays in its modernization programs, the Biden administration began considering several near-term options to augment its existing forces. One such option is to upload additional warheads onto the current fleet of Minuteman III ICBMs, which, in compliance with New START limits, now carry only a single warhead each, but are capable of carrying more. Another proposal involves extending the operational lifetime of several Ohio-class submarines for a few more years to ensure there is no dip in the number of available launchers before the new Columbia-class boats are ready. Similarly, planners are looking at reactivating the 4 missile launchers on each Ohio-class submarine that were capped or deactivated to comply with the soon-to-expire treaty, allowing them to carry their full complement of 24 Trident missiles once again. These near-term fixes, while necessary, are ultimately stopgap measures. To truly avoid the looming launcher cliff in the most survivable leg of the nuclear triad, the United States must commit to a more robust long-term plan. This means building a larger number of Columbia-class submarines in the 2040s and beyond, at least 14 to match the current fleet size and perhaps even more, to provide a hedge against the continued and unconstrained growth of Chinese and Russian arsenals. The central deterrence problem is not a temporary issue. It is the defining strategic reality of the new nuclear age. The United States must therefore rethink its force posture from the ground up to ensure it has the capacity and flexibility to maintain a credible deterrent against two nuclear peers for decades to come, ensuring the ultimate security of the American homeland. In response to the immense challenge posed by China's nuclear expansion, some experts have proposed a fundamental and highly controversial shift in U.S. nuclear strategy. They advocate for abandoning the long-standing American approach of counterforce targeting. The current strategy, working in concert with missile defenses, seeks to limit damage to the United States and its allies by holding at risk an adversary's nuclear forces, their missiles, bombers, and command centers. To do this effectively against two growing peer arsenals, the United States would need to deploy more weapons. To avoid this, these strategists propose a shift to a countervalue strategy, where the U.S. would no longer try to target adversary military forces. Instead, it would explicitly threaten to retaliate against a small number of key population centers, critical infrastructure, and sources of political and economic power. Proponents of this countervalue approach argue that it is a more efficient and stable way to deter in a multipolar world. They contend that this strategic shift would require no major adjustments to the current U.S. force posture. The survivability of America's ballistic missile submarines, hidden in the depths of the ocean, ensures that the United States will always be able to launch a devastating retaliatory strike. The guaranteed destruction of a few major cities, they argue, is more than enough to deter any rational leader from launching a first strike against the United States. In this view, the complex and expensive task of targeting hundreds of hardened missile silos becomes unnecessary. The simple, terrifying threat of urban annihilation is sufficient for deterrence. This would, in theory, allow the U.S. to cap its arsenal and avoid a costly arms race. However, this argument conveniently sidesteps the profound legal and moral issues inherent in a strategy that intentionally targets civilian populations for mass slaughter. Such a policy would represent a radical departure from the laws of armed conflict and America's own stated values. But even setting aside these critical ethical considerations, a countervalue strategy is strategically unsound and incredibly risky. It would force a U.S. president into an all-or-nothing dilemma. In a crisis, their only option would be to retaliate by killing millions of civilians, which would almost certainly provoke a similar devastating reprisal against American cities. The prospect of this horrific exchange raises serious questions about whether any president would actually authorize such an attack, thereby undermining the credibility of the deterrent itself. It unnecessarily risks millions of American lives, the very thing a president is sworn to protect. Furthermore, a shift to a countervalue strategy would be catastrophic for extended deterrence and non-proliferation. Allies would look at this new posture with horror and disbelief. They would see a United States holding its nuclear forces in reserve solely to deter attacks on its own homeland by threatening to trade cities, effectively abandoning the mission of limiting damage in a regional war. An ally facing a conventional attack or nuclear blackmail from Russia or China would rightly conclude that the U.S. would never initiate a city-busting exchange on their behalf. This would confirm their worst fears of abandonment and give them no other choice but to seek their own nuclear arsenals for protection. The United States learned this lesson in the 1960s, and abandoning it now would trigger the very proliferation cascade it seeks to prevent. Given the profound drawbacks of a countervalue strategy, a much better approach would be to adapt the current counterforce strategy for the realities of the new era. This does not require a panicked, open-ended arms race. It is crucial to understand that deterrence has never been a simple function of raw warhead comparisons. The U.S. nuclear stockpile today, for instance, is not identical in size or composition to Russia's, which possesses a much larger number of non-strategic nuclear weapons. Effective deterrence is about having the right capabilities to hold at risk the things an adversary values most, which for both Moscow and Beijing includes their ability to project nuclear power. Therefore, maintaining a credible counterforce option remains essential for a stable deterrent. A key insight is that counterforce targeting is driven by the composition, not necessarily the absolute size, of an adversary's arsenal. This means that the United States can maintain a credible deterrent with only a modest adjustment to its forces, tailored specifically to address the most significant new threat, China's massive build-out of hardened ICBM silos. Unless China and Russia make the choice to dramatically expand their arsenals far beyond what they currently plan, the United States should not need to expand its overall existing stockpile of roughly 3,800 total warheads. The challenge is not about building thousands of new bombs. Instead, it is about changing the deployed arsenal to ensure the US has enough warheads on alert to cover the expanded target sets in both China and Russia simultaneously, while retaining a secure reserve. This is a solvable problem that requires thoughtful planning, not a wholesale return to Cold War-level numbers. The crucial task for US strategists is to reassess priorities and reallocate resources within the existing and planned force structure. This involves a careful analysis of the roles of different types of capabilities. For example, planners must determine the right mix of regional nuclear systems, like the proposed sea-launched cruise missile, needed to deter local aggression in Asia and Europe, and how those systems interact with the strategic triad. They must also analyze how to best fortify the central strategic deterrent, given the forces available. This could mean prioritizing sea-based capabilities for their survivability, or re-emphasizing land-based systems for their responsiveness and ability to absorb a first strike, thereby creating complex targeting problems for an adversary. Different combinations of forces can achieve the desired deterrent effect. Fortunately, US planners have multiple pathways to rebuild credible deterrents using existing and planned forces, even with modernization delays. The near-term options outlined by the Biden administration, such as uploading more warheads on ICBMs and extending the life of Ohio-class submarines, make this clear. These are not panic moves but prudent adjustments. In the long term, committing to a larger fleet of Columbia-class submarines or developing more flexible delivery systems provides further options. If designed in the right way, even modest, short-term and long-term adjustments to the composition and deployment of US forces can maintain a credible and effective deterrent against both China and Russia at a reasonable and sustainable cost, without resorting to dangerous and destabilizing strategic shifts. To survive the new nuclear age, the United States must recognize that its nuclear strategy is not just about hardware and targeting plans, it is also a critical instrument of diplomacy and alliance management. An effective strategy, requires far more than just having the right weapons. Washington can no longer afford to relegate nuclear issues to a small, insulated community of technical experts. The profound transformation of the global nuclear landscape demands deep, sustained engagement from the most senior leaders in government, just as it did during the Cold War. Nothing will do more to enhance the credibility of the extended deterrence commitment that the United States offers to its allies in Asia and Europe than a clear, consistent, and visible demonstration that the President, the Cabinet, and congressional leaders are actively engaged and preparing for the coming challenges. This means the United States must explicitly and repeatedly reaffirm that its software, its political will to defend its allies with the full range of its capabilities, is just as strong and reliable as its hardware. Washington must leave no room for doubt that it remains fully committed to the concept of extended deterrence, and that it is determined to make this guarantee credible against new and emerging threats. This is not just about rhetoric, it requires concrete action. Previous efforts in this direction, such as the deepened consultations within NATO's Nuclear Planning Group and the establishment of the US-South Korea Nuclear Consultative Group, have been successful. They have spurred allies to make greater contributions to their own defense, and have helped reassure them of America's steadfastness. These efforts must now be redoubled to head off a potential wave of proliferation born of Allied anxiety. Unless the United States is prepared to radically depart from its enduring grand strategy, and in doing so, risk exposing its homeland to greater danger and shattering the trust of its allies, it will need to deploy a force that is more numerous, more diverse, and more capable. America requires a more flexible and robust arsenal not because it intends to fight a nuclear war, but precisely to ensure such a war never happens. The purpose of a strong deterrent is to prevent conflict by convincing any potential adversary that the costs of aggression would be unacceptably high. A credible U.S. nuclear posture is the ultimate peacekeeping tool, providing the stability and security that allows diplomacy and conventional deterrence to work. A failure to invest in this credibility will invite aggression and instability. In the final analysis, the path forward requires a holistic approach. It means adapting the U.S. arsenal with modest but critical adjustments to meet the two-peer threat. It means senior leaders must re-engage with nuclear strategy as a top national priority. And it means using that strategy as a tool to reassure allies, thereby strengthening the non-proliferation regime. The United States cannot simply wish away the new realities of the nuclear age. It cannot hope that China's expansion will be reversed or that Russia will become a responsible actor. It must prepare for the world as it is. By making smart, deliberate choices now, the U.S. can maintain a credible deterrent, keep its allies secure, and navigate the perilous waters of this new nuclear age without firing a single shot. The world has irrevocably entered a new and more treacherous nuclear era. For several decades following the Cold War, many senior American officials harbored the hope that nuclear weapons might gradually recede, becoming relics of a bygone age. That prospect has been revealed as a dangerous illusion. Instead, nuclear weapons are back with a vengeance, their salience growing as great power competition intensifies. The United States must now confront this reality head-on, beginning with a clear-eyed recognition of the world as it is. This requires acknowledging the gravity of threats from Russia, China, and North Korea, whose actions are reshaping the strategic landscape. This demands a concerted effort to realign the American arsenal. U.S. officials must work together to build national consensus around the need for a more robust nuclear posture. It is no longer sufficient to hope that China's expansion might be reversed, or that Russia might moderate its aggressive behavior. Prudent strategy must be based on capabilities, not hopes. This will require difficult choices and significant investment, but the cost of inaction is far greater. The United States cannot afford to be caught unprepared for the impending nuclear hurricane. To navigate this environment successfully, the United States will need its finest strategic minds. The challenges of deterring two nuclear peers simultaneously are intellectually demanding and without precedent. This will require a renaissance in strategic thought, bringing together experts from government, academia, and the military to develop new concepts for deterrence, arms control, and crisis management. This intellectual mobilization is critical. Without sound strategy, even advanced weapons will fail. If the United States does not take urgent action, it could find itself in a catastrophic situation in which China, Russia, or North Korea miscalculates and uses a nuclear weapon against a U.S. ally or the American homeland. This would be a failure of deterrence of the highest order. The imperative is to act now to preserve peace through strength and clarity of purpose. As the United States adapts its own nuclear posture to the new strategic reality, it must simultaneously pursue a reinvigorated and innovative approach to arms control and risk reduction. These two tracks, strengthening deterrence and pursuing diplomacy, are not contradictory. In fact, they are mutually reinforcing. Indeed, by demonstrating its resolve to modernize and adapt its forces to counter growing threats, the United States could create new incentives for China and Russia to finally come to the negotiating table. A position of strength is the best foundation for effective diplomacy. When adversaries understand that they cannot gain a strategic advantage through an unconstrained arms race, they may become more willing to discuss mutual restraints that enhance stability for all parties. The goal is to make arms control a more attractive option than continued competition. Should such an opportunity for dialogue arise, Washington must be prepared with creative and flexible proposals tailored to the complexities of a multipolar nuclear world. Bilateral agreements of the Cold War mold are no longer sufficient. Future arrangements must account for the evolving and emerging threats from multiple actors. For example, a potential successor to the New START treaty with Russia could, in theory, permit a higher ceiling for deployed warheads. This would maintain the essential framework of mutual stability and verification between Washington and Moscow, while giving the United States the flexibility it needs to allocate a portion of its arsenal to credibly deter the growing threat from China's expanding ICBM force. This approach would preserve strategic stability where possible, while adapting to new dangers where necessary. Achieving any form of comprehensive agreement that establishes guardrails across all domains, from non-strategic and strategic weapons to missile defenses and space capabilities, will be an extraordinarily complex undertaking. Success will demand innovative thinking that breaks from past models. One potential approach could be modeled on the 1922 Washington Naval Conference, which successfully averted a post-World War I naval arms race. That treaty limited the overall tonnage of great power navies, but tailored the specific limits to each nation's unique strategic needs, geographic position, and existing naval status. A similar framework for nuclear forces could impose overall warhead limitations on all nuclear states, while allowing for specific, negotiated exclusions or asymmetries to address imbalances in conventional forces or regional security dynamics. Regardless of the precise path taken, American policymakers must urgently craft a range of creative and practical solutions, both formal and informal, to manage a world of multiple nuclear actors who are currently unwilling to negotiate in good faith. This could include unilateral transparency measures, bilateral dialogues on doctrine, or multilateral codes of conduct for behavior in space or cyberspace. The absence of willing partners cannot be an excuse for inaction. The United States must lead the charge in thinking about and proposing new forms of risk reduction, demonstrating to the world that it is committed to strategic stability, even as it takes the necessary steps to ensure its own defense in a more dangerous age. The journey through this new nuclear age will ultimately be a test of American leadership. The challenges are formidable, but they are not insurmountable. The United States possesses immense strengths, not least of which is its unparalleled global network of alliances. This network is a strategic asset of incalculable value, and it must be nurtured and reaffirmed. In no conceivable future is the United States safer without its allies, regardless of the costs and responsibilities that come with leadership. Therefore, a central element of any successful strategy must be to redouble efforts to reassure partners in Europe and Asia. Washington must demonstrate through both words and deeds that its security guarantees and its extended nuclear deterrent remain credible, steadfast, and ironclad. This political commitment is the glue that holds the alliance system together. This reaffirmation of leadership also requires a renewed commitment at home. The United States must show the world, and especially its adversaries, that it has the political will and national resolve to see through its strategic adjustments. This will require a concerted effort by senior officials and members of Congress from both parties to educate the American public about the stakes involved and to build a durable consensus for a sustained investment in the nation's nuclear enterprise. A strong and credible deterrent cannot be built on a foundation of political division or budgetary uncertainty. It requires a long-term, whole-of-government approach that signals to allies and adversaries alike that American resolve will not waver. The core of the task ahead is to build a more flexible and robust arsenal, not to fight a nuclear war, but to ensure one never breaks out. The purpose of modernizing and adapting the U.S. nuclear force is to prevent conflict and coercion. By maintaining a deterrent that is second to none, the United States underwrites global stability, discourages aggression, and creates the space for diplomacy to succeed. A strong nuclear posture is the essential foundation upon which other elements of national power can be effectively employed. It is the ultimate insurance policy against existential threats, a policy that America and its allies cannot afford to let lapse in this increasingly perilous world. In the final analysis, surviving and thriving in the new nuclear age requires a blend of strength, wisdom, and resolve. It demands that the United States adapt its military capabilities to meet the reality of a two-peer threat environment. It demands the intellectual creativity to forge new arms control and risk reduction measures. And above all, it demands the leadership to reassure allies, unite the nation, and demonstrate an unwavering commitment to preserving peace. The path forward is difficult, but with far-sighted strategy and steadfast purpose, the United States can navigate the dangers of this era and secure a safer future for itself and for the world.